In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's talk about data, specifically who owns your data and who's using your data. We've had a couple of interesting things happen recently. One, we've had one client who wants to do a specific kind of tracking on their website, and Google Analytics 4 simply cannot do it. You would have to make some significant modifications to the code of your website to accommodate GA4, as opposed to making the tool work for you. That's one aspect. Second aspect, ChatGPT recently announced its ChatGPT Enterprise Edition, which we're pretty sure is going to be reassuringly expensive. And the promise there is that your data will not be used by OpenAI to train their models. This goes in tandem with a huge number of lawsuits and questions and things going on about who owns the data that these models are being trained on. That also goes with questions we've had in our Slack groups, like our Analytics for Marketers Slack group, which you can get to at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. Someone asking, hey, I have some interest in a custom model for this. And our first question is, do you have the data? Because if you don't have the data, you can't tune a model. And you probably don't want to be making part of the secret sauce of your business based on data that you don't own, that you didn't put into the model yourself. So all of this to say that right now companies are at an inflection point. If you don't own your data, or at least a good portion of it, you may be at risk not only from just not being able to do basic things like analytics tracking, but may not be able to take advantage, say, of generative AI to its fullest capacity. So Katie, where should the decision makers be thinking about data ownership? Where should their heads be?
That is an excellent question. As I'm running through different scenarios in my head. That's sort of where the pause is coming from, because I'm thinking about things like CDPs. I'm thinking about things like even as simple as Google Analytics. If you can't export all of your data about your digital assets, then you don't actually own that data. And so it's tricky because not every company has the resources to build their own systems in order to collect that data. It's not scalable. It doesn't make sense. That's why there's such, a deep bench in the MarTech world and of software systems that do this for you. But I would say one of the first things I would look at when evaluating a tool that collects my data is, how do I get the data out of it? Or is it something that I can't get the data out of? I think of LinkedIn as a really good example. And so, I can post 6 times a day, every single day. And is that technically my data? Well, it's my work, it's my action, it's the things that I have done, but I'm doing it on their platform. And therefore, my work is their data. It's not my data. It's data around my actions, but they still own it. And I don't have a right to try to extract that data from them if they don't want me to. And that's sort of where we need to be thinking about, if we want to be doing deeper, more focused analysis on customer behaviors, on potential sales and revenue models and all those things, like, how do we get that data? And that's what I start thinking about. So when you're asking the question to go back, what do decision makers need to be thinking about? It's what am I going to need to do the data? Why am I collecting the data in the first place? Why do I even care about this data point? I may not know what I'm going to do with it down the line, but I should be aware that it exists and how I can access it.
Yeah, and I think that question of who owns your data really is at the crux of it. If you are, you are the CEO of Trust Insights. We have a lot of data on a lot of different systems. Who owns that data? Do we own it? Does OpenAI own it? Does Google own it? And for the things that we want to do as a company strategically, what do we need to own that we currently do not own? LinkedIn, like you said, is a great example. Even our analytics. So we run the Matomo analytics system, which is an open source version of web analytics. It's not as fully featured or as capable as Google Analytics, but we own it. It's on our servers. We have access to the backend database, to the raw data itself. So that if we wanted to, we could build models and things from it, which you can't do nearly as easily with a system like Google Analytics.
And, I think that there's, again, it's sort of you can't build everything yourself. We're even Google relies on third party tools, probably like a CRM system, a marketing automation system. I'm making assumptions, but so, even they don't wholly own all of their data. Um, and so it really comes down to thinking through like basically the prioritization. What data do you absolutely have to have? So revenue data, for example, you probably want to own that data. And so yes, you can use a third party system like a QuickBooks or some other accounting tool, but you need to be able to work with that system to extract all of it in order to understand what's going on with your business. So that's data that you need to be able to own. Do I need to own all of my social media data? Well, that's not the kind of business that we operate. So for us, it's not as essential. But if we ran a social media agency, that's probably a higher priority. For us, thinking about things like Google Analytics, I don't know that we had an easier time extracting data from Universal Analytics, but I think it wasn't as riddled with issues as it is with Google Analytics 4 and their, data API where the data is different. And that's a question we get a lot is why is my data different in the system versus when it's in Looker Studio versus, when I extract it through the API. Those are considerations when you think about, do I need to own this data? Do I need to have it all the time? What am I going to do with it?
You raised a really interesting point, particularly around social media data, and this goes into the way generative AI functions and AI models in general. One of the considerations that decision makers need to think about in terms of who owns your data is also then who has access to your data. So if you are using a social media marketing tool and they say, hey, we've got generative AI that's custom trained to help you write better social posts, right? That model was trained on something. If you are using, I'm going to make up a name, you're using, Spam Social, and Spam Social has its own custom trained model, and Spam Social is training on everyone who's using the system, then by default, it's training on your data, which means that you are also, by extension, giving your competitors access to a derivative of your data. So if you write really great, social media posts and you use Spam Social to post them on LinkedIn, and you get great numbers on it, if Spam Social is using that data to train its language model, to customize it, and you have a direct competitor also using Spam Social, you are helping your competitor write better social content based on your data.
A little bit tangential, but it strikes me that every once in a while, like every few months or so, I'll start to see Facebook posts where, you know, members will have these long posts of, I do not give Facebook authority to use my pictures, to use my thing, copy and paste, blah, blah, blah. And it always hurts my heart a little bit. One, because there's no convincing them that that's not how it works. But two, uh, when they signed on to the platform and did not read the terms of use, they already gave up those rights to their own data. And, saying like, it's like the old Michael Scott, I declare bankruptcy. Well, that's not how that works. You can't just declare it and all of your money troubles go away. There's a lot that goes into it. And when you're on a social media platform, just by being on there, you've already given up a lot of your data. You don't own that data. That platform, even though they say we're not going to sell your data, there's a lot of loopholes and legal language with that. And so it's the same with any system with a CRM, let's, say, Salesforce, for example. Your data may be behind a password, but it lives on their servers and they may be using your data to train large language models.
Exactly. And so the question is then, your loophole example is exactly right. Facebook may not sell your data,
Mhm.
but they train a model based on your data, and then they sell access to that model. And they let competitors use that model. And this is not even just for language models. This is for classical AI and machine learning as well.
Mhm.
Selling access to that model takes essentially the important part of your data, the part that says this is what works, and sells access to that. And so I think for decision makers, for the CEOs of the world who are looking at the AI space, these are considerations that you've got to take into account. Who owns your data? Who has access to your data? And who is giving derivatives of your data to your competitors?
Well, and this is where, Chris, you've talked about the cautions with using tools like ChatGPT and putting certain kinds of data in there. So people are asking, you know, any and all kinds of questions of these tools, here's my sales forecast for the last year. What can I do better? Well, guess what? They have that data now. Here's my list of customers. Who else, what does the profile look like? Well, guess what? They have that data now. And it's going to continue to use that data to, build recommendations for other people, including your competitors. And so the solution there, and it's not an easy solution, is to build and train your own large language model. But again, that goes back to that's not a reasonable thing for a lot of companies. They don't have the resources, they don't have the infrastructure to build their own CRM, to build their own web tracking tool, to build their own, large language model trained only solely on their data. There has to be versions of that based on what kind of industry you work in. So healthcare, for example, it's you kind of have to. They're forced into it. So there needs to be a roadmap for the healthcare industry. There needs to be a roadmap for the financial or the legal industry. But for B2B marketing, we shouldn't be dealing with PII in the first place. So we're probably lower on the list of industries that are going to have access to our own tools.
I mean, we do though. If you think about it, if you go into HubSpot and you go your marketing automation system of choice, it's swimming in PII, right? You have people's names and job titles, their email addresses, their phone numbers and stuff. You have
Mhm.
stuff. You have enough data in there that if it leaked, you would have an identity theft problem. And that's sort of the standard is if it leaks, could someone compromise someone else's identity with it? And as marketers, we don't think about that, but it's
Mhm.
100% true. We do. So I actually got a question very recently about this, about accounting. How do you set up systems to use language models in the accounting world, given that regulations are changing so often, and also the sensitivity of the data? And there's sort of two approaches to language models in general. One is the perfect memory model. Hey, this model is going to get trained on everything. It's going to know everything. We ask it questions, it gives us answers. That's a very sort of older approach to these systems now that is still effective, but it contains a lot of problems. And the newer model, the newer approach is the hybrid model, where you use the language model to do what it does best, which is language, and you connect it to your data sources so that you're not asking it for knowledge. You're just asking it to write language that can interface with other systems. So in the accounting example, you would have a database that you own that contains all your accounting regulations, contains your customer data maybe, and then you have some code glue that glues it to a language model. So you ask the language model questions, it goes and queries the database. The database returns answers, and the language model converts those answers back into regular language. The model does not know information in the database. The model just knows how to speak, and that sort of is the architecture that a lot of companies are now taking, because for one thing, it allows you to pull the model out and put another model in. So as new models come about, you can swap in out easier. And two, it creates those firewalls that allow you to say, okay, yeah, model, we're not going to give you this information. You just have to interpret the results, and that allows you to run a language model locally on your servers, one of the open source models. They don't have to know everything at that point. They just have to be able to interpret language well. And so that protects your company and protects your data, because now your model's running on your servers, your database is running on your servers, And at no point are you handing this very sensitive information to a third party that may or may not be trustworthy.
So you've mentioned a couple of things that I don't believe are accessible to everyone. So one is, you know, having the skill set to stand up a large language model that can have, interchangeable, training models. That to me strikes me as a skill set that not, that account manager or
Yeah, no.
a an analyst might have, but you would need a data scientist. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is you're mentioning your servers. How many companies do you know, not talking about like enterprise size companies, but like, companies similar to ours have their own servers or even know where to start to stand those up? Because even those technically belong to someone else. They're our servers, but we have to get the equipment from somewhere. We have to get the server space from somewhere. And so I'm not trying to say that it's not possible. I'm just trying to understand how it's accessible.
And that's a good question. So it depends. It depends on the sophistication of the company, and because almost most companies do have their own servers, even if they don't know it. Right? If you have a
Hmm.
website, you have a server somewhere, and the data protection on those typically is of a higher standard, because that's straight up IT. That's not even marketing anymore. That's just straight up IT. Is
Right.
like this server is governed by these things. One of the Trust Insight servers is sitting on a shelf over there. It's this little box that I have plugged in. So, and that's where I do a lot of experimental stuff because I got this thing on Amazon's Black Friday sale last year. Um, is it production ready? I would not put that into production like for a client because it's the cat could knock it off. But yeah, for companies that have these problems, like healthcare companies, like finance companies, they already have either agreements with cloud hosting providers like Azure, Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or whatever that have very strong data protections because they have to, or they have, if they're a legacy company, they probably have a room full of hardware somewhere that with all the air conditioning and stuff. So the companies do have these resources, but this is where, again, this goes back to the to CEO level stuff, not just marketing stuff.
Hmm.
You've got an IT department. You've probably got a CIO if you're a larger company. And this is where you need to have governance and integration across your company so that what marketing wants to do with data has to has to be integrated with what IT says you can and can't do, has to be integrated with what legal says you can and can't do. And all those departments have to work together. And so your job as the CEO is to make everyone work together.
Easier said than done. But I think that that's a really good point because I don't think that there was that initial realization of how cross discipline this kind of new technology really was going to be. So if we look at Google Analytics, for example, installing Google Analytics might involve your IT department to get permission to include it on the website. It might include legal to read over the terms of use and the data retention policies and say yes or no or tweak them. But then once all that is done, those two teams are essentially not needed to run Google Analytics anymore. You need your marketing team, you need your data team. But in this instance, when we're talking about something like generative AI, legal and IT can't disengage from the process. They need to be true partners with marketing and data and sales and everyone else. And so, in some ways, it's really an opportunity to introduce that collaboration. When I worked at the company that I often refer to a million years ago, that was a big problem because IT, we had the server room. My desk was near it. We had the server room. You open the door, you hear the whoosh of all the air conditioners and the servers running. It's dark. You see the lights. It's very like gothy and emo. And so you see everything. And our IT person was very like all of the cables were perfectly aligned and like actually very aesthetically pleasing to look at. But God forbid you ask this person to sit in the same room as development or sit in the same room with pretty much anybody and you knew that you had to like eat your Wheaties that morning and make sure you had 6 cups of coffee because the gloves were going to come off, because the IT person definitely didn't feel like anybody else understood how data worked and just didn't want anybody touching it. Like, just don't touch it. You're not just don't. I don't even want to talk about it. No, don't ask me anything. Just don't touch it. And it was a very contentious conversation. And so we had a lot of opportunities for collaboration, but there were so many personality clashes. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't just this person who was sticky. Every other team felt the same way about the work that they did. It was a very siloed company, even for only being about 50 people. And the collaboration was nearly impossible because nobody was willing to understand why somebody else should know what they were doing. And so a lot of companies, I think, are going to be facing this cultural challenge right now of their teams have been conditioned to be so siloed to think that their thing is the most important thing, that when you ask them to share their toys in the sandbox, they're going to start hand slapping. It's not going to happen. They're just going to say, no, you can't come into my area. You don't need to know what I do. That's not your business. And so when they're trying to introduce technology like generative AI that requires that collaboration, I'm just seeing a whole lot of headache. And that, Chris, to your question, that's where the CEO has to start. The CEO has to say, how am I going to get all of these really strong personalities to sit in the same room together and not, end up as an MMA match?
The answer to that, and this is kind of a management consulting trope, is you introduce something like generative AI or digital transformation or business process reengineering or Six Sigma or something. There's some initiative that
Mhm.
has a banner and a flag. Maybe there's signs up in the office, classic office space stuff. Um,
Although you're not kidding, like a literal banner and a flag to wave. Like I've been there,
exactly.
done that.
Exactly. But you do that because that gives everyone a purpose. And with generative AI, because it's so new, people don't have a grudge to fight on the generative AI stuff itself, right? Everyone's like, okay, well, the CEO said to do this, so we got to do this. And it can create if it's done well, you can start to create those collaborative links between organizations that then have a halo effect. Hey, the folks in IT are starting to actually talk to the folks in marketing, in a non-adversarial way on specific project. And if you can help create those relationships within the organization, then that can spill over into other areas where it's no longer as contentious, for IT and marketing. Say, well, by the way, our CRM is still kind of a mess. We still need some help with this. So it's a good excuse if it's managed well. It's a good excuse to knock down some of those silos at least a little bit. At least they build some planks, catwalks between the silos. Um, because going back to the original question of who owns your data, yeah, in a large organization, especially, your data ownership is shared across all these different silos. You even in the ideal situation, your company has different internal owners of data, and to your point, they can be very, very protective of that.
I appreciate how naive and optimistic you are when it comes to people management. Like what you're
That's why I don't do it.
describing, well, you're not wrong. Like introducing an initiative that's new and everybody can get behind is a good way to approach it, but it's not as simple as that, which is why a lot of times companies will bring in a neutral third party, not just to introduce the initiative, but almost to just referee the initiative. Because it's not that the people internally can't manage the situation, it's that it tends to be very emotionally charged, even though it's business. People take these things very personally. And so bringing in a neutral third party, like Trust Insights, for example, is a really great way to let them be the bad guy, let them referee the conversations and introduce the initiatives that, yes, you are capable of handling, but it takes you out of the conversation as, oh, well, you gave sales, 30 more seconds of airtime than you did marketing, when talking about what they own. So they must be more important than marketing. Let the third party consultant take that heat. Let, for example, like if I were to go into a company, my job would be basically to mediate the conversation and make sure that things are being talked about in a productive manner. So when people get angry, when people get frustrated, the heat's not on the CEO, the heat's on me as the third party who's coming in to, basically turn their world upside down. Let me be the person who sort of takes that on their shoulders so that you, the CEO, still remain the figurehead, the person pushing this forward, the leader that everybody needs to look to. So basically, my job as the third party is to make you look really fantastic. And I have to take, all of the, bad feelings and curses and insults. But that's fine because then you add a zero to the, agreement and everybody's happy at the end of the day.
Everyone's happy at the end of the day. But also, those exercises allow you to get a better understanding of who owns your data.
Right.
Because when we do those kinds of explorations within companies, we often find out that there are significant data ownership problems. One of the ones that comes to mind is we worked with a biotech company that had three separate, independent, non-managed instances of Salesforce. They were paying for Salesforce.com 3 times. Their leads and their opportunities were scattered across these 3 systems. They had different scoring systems. They had different opportunity stages. And when we rationalized that, it basically, they had lost, because of these discontinuities, they'd lost track of $1.5 billion in pipeline because no one could find it. It was in, if it was in one system, the person was looking for it there, but no, it was actually in the other system. This is a case where the data ownership wasn't necessarily in question because the company owns the data they put in the Salesforce, but they had no idea who owned the data internally. And so when they rationalized it finally, they're like, oh, whoops.
And, and that is a big part of these exercises, is to your point, Chris, is using them as an excuse to get these people together to talk about who owns the data. So for example, if we go back to the Google Analytics instance, you may find that there's a difference of opinion between IT development and marketing of who owns the Google Analytics data. IT might say, well, you've put it on my servers, my website. Developers might say, well, I had to actually do the work to implement it. And marketing might say, but I'm the one who needs to use it. And so everyone in that instance is right. However, it needs to be more collaborative than that. So there are opportunities to find collaborative paths, but it absolutely needs to be, if you're introducing something new like generative AI, that needs to be your first order of business, is understanding what that governance looks like, because there's so many ways that it could go wrong.
And very often does. Very often does. So to summarize, you need to know who owns your data internally and externally, where it lives. If you want to be able to use it for generative AI, if you want to be able to use it for any new initiative where you have opportunity, but you also have risk. So you want to de-risk yourself, you want to de-risk your projects, you want to ensure that you can make use of the technologies. Before you even start talking about which system and architecture, you need to know, hey, who owns this stuff internally? Because if you don't, it's going to get really, really hard to make a project successful and comprehensive. And the bigger your company is, the more of a pain it's going to be. If you have comments or questions or projects you've done, just try and figure out who owns your data, and you want to share some thoughts or ask some questions, go to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,500 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. We can find the show on most channels. And while you're there, on the channel of your choice, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.